And when it's Good morning, everyone. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will now come to order. We are meeting today to hear testimony on a number of ocean and fisheries-related bills. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at this hearing are limited to the chairman, the ranking member, the vice chair, and the vice-ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and helps keep members on their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all members' opening statements be made part of the record if they are submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. I think we have an LSU fan that just walked in the hearing room. All right, so I will begin. Good morning. I want to thank you for joining us for this, our first hearing of the new year. As many of you know, one of my top priorities in this committee is the sustainability of our nation's fisheries. Our oceans and fishing communities around the country are facing challenges from climate change and other man-made problems, and we need real solutions. So I'm pleased that we have a lineup of bipartisan bills today for our consideration. I'm proud to be the lead sponsor on two of them. The Salmon-Focused Investments in Sustainable Habitats Act, which identifies and protects pristine salmon habitats, and the Fisheries Fund Act, which improves the fishery disaster relief program so that we can get help to impacted communities in a timely manner. Now, during our first panel, I'll go into further detail about those two bills, but right now I'd like to focus on the other legislation before us today. Starting with coral reefs. Thank you, Mr. Rooney. Coral reefs are vital habitat for many commercially important fisheries, as well as hubs for tourism and recreation. Unfortunately, as we all know, studies show that certain chemicals in sunscreens, specifically oxybenzone and octinoxate, can contribute to this very worrying problem of coral bleaching. Representative Rooney's bill, H.R. 1834, addresses this issue. It would prohibit the use of sunscreens containing these chemicals in national marine sanctuaries, ensuring that coral reefs in these protected areas have the best shot at survival. Sunscreens without these harmful chemicals are readily available at comparable prices. So this is a common sense solution for visitors to our beautiful national marine sanctuaries. And all of that being said, I would like to see, and I will hope to work with Mr. Rooney on an amendment that clarifies that this is not a pro-melanoma or anti-sunscreen bill. We care about those things too. But we can have our sunscreen and we can have our cancer protection while also protecting coral reefs, and I think we can clarify that. Next, we will discuss Congresswoman Dingell's Forage Fish Conservation Act. Forage fish are small, schooling, plankton-eating fish, such as anchovies, sardines, menhaden, herring, squid, and krill. Forage fish make up a third of the global wild marine fish catch. These species are sensitive to environmental conditions. They naturally go through boom and bust cycles. But fishing pressure can make it difficult for their populations to rebound. Their natural predators, like larger fish, sea lions, whales, and seabirds, depend on them. So when forage fish populations are low, the whole ocean food chain suffers. While several fishery management councils, including Mid-Atlantic, Pacific, and North Pacific, have taken important steps on this issue with precautionary management measures, many forage fish species populations remain very low. For example, the crucially important Pacific sardine and northern anchovy. These fish have experienced about a 95% decline in population since 2006. Representative Dingell's bill would address these issues by directing Noaa Fisheries and our councils to implement more proactive management of forage fish species. So I look forward to discussing this legislation to ensure we're taking the right steps to manage forage fish without any unintended consequences. Now, climate change poses another challenge to fishery management, and I've heard a lot about this on my Magnuson listening tour that I'm about halfway through now, making my way around the country. Whether it is rapidly shifting stocks in the Atlantic or warm ocean blobs in the Pacific, climate change is already having a huge impact on U.S. fisheries. Shifting stocks in particular create big problems for managers, especially with catch allocation on the Atlantic coast. It's unclear how fishery management councils can and will address these changes, but we clearly need to get moving. And Representative Cunningham's H.R. 4679 would help us do that. It would direct the GAO to report to Congress on efforts by the councils, the Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Commission, and Noaa Fisheries to prepare for and adapt to climate change. This is a very important first step. Finally, I'm excited to discuss Representative Graves' Descend Act. It's a bill that I co-sponsored to require descending devices when fishing for reef fish. Descending devices include weighted hooks, lip clamps, and release boxes that help fish return to depth without causing damage to their swim bladders. These devices help reduce mortality of reef fishes like snapper and grouper and help sustain those important fishery populations. All of the legislation before us today is bipartisan. It all helps make our oceans and fisheries more sustainable in the face of man-made threats. And as we see more headlines of marine heat waves, bleached coral reefs, and increasing impact of climate change on fisheries, it is our job in Congress to investigate these issues and offer solutions, which these bills aim to do. So I will now turn it over to our ranking member for his remarks, and then we'll hear from the lead sponsors of the bills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Subcommittee meets today to hear testimony on a variety of bills. H.R. 4679 by Mr. Cunningham authorizes a duplicative study on the impact climate change has on federal fisheries management. It should be noted that Noaa and GAO have recently completed similar studies. H.R. 1834 by Mr. Rooney would ban the use of sunscreens made with oxybenzone or octonazate, if I get that right,
Better than me.
in national marine sanctuaries that contain coral. I'm concerned this bill will limit access to sunscreen protection options for consumers, as 70% of sunscreens in the U.S. contain the ingredients being banned by this bill. H.R. 2236 by Mrs. Dingell would amend the Magnuson-Stevens Act to create a new definition for forage fish. This proposed definition has already created confusion amongst the regional fishery management councils. One regional council thinks the definition too broad, while another council believes it limits the council's ability to manage what they consider forage species. H.R. 5126 by Mr. Graves would amend the Magnuson-Stevens Act to require the possession of a venting tool or a descending device when fishing in the Gulf of Mexico exclusive economic zone. Finally, we have two bills by our chairman, Mr. Huffman. H.R. 5548 attempts to assist with fishery disasters, and H.R. 4723 aims to further protect an already protected species while attacking Western states' ability to develop and manage water infrastructure. While H.R. 4723 would create salmon conservation areas and watersheds or areas that have attributes important to sustaining viable populations of salmon or be regionally significant for the conservation of salmon, yet a key criterion not explicitly necessary is the presence of salmon. Just as troubling is the lack of stakeholder inclusion. This bill explicitly leaves out the Bureau of Reclamation, the Army Corps of Engineers, municipalities, and other relevant water users from consultation. In Idaho, we take a different approach. Last year, Governor Brad Little established a work group dedicated to addressing salmon and steelhead issues. The work group brings together representatives from industry, conservation, sportsmen, state and local leaders, and other stakeholders. I believe this is a better approach to solving the salmon recovery issues. I must also note that this bill includes two controversial provisions. One prioritizes the decommissioning of forest roads, and the other makes a significant change to how the Nepa process works. I look forward to hearing from our witness, who will explain how this seemingly small provision can have grave implications. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fulcher, and I would now like to welcome the lead sponsors of today's bills to make some remarks. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they should limit their oral testimony to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, everybody knows this, but the lights will be green. At the 1 minute point, it's yellow, and the red light means it is time to wrap up. We'll first hear from Representative Rooney of Florida, the lead sponsor of H.R. 1834, the Defending Our National Marine Sanctuaries from Damaging Chemicals Act of 2019. Representative Rooney, thanks for joining us here. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and Representative Fulcher, as well as other members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to comment on H.R. 1834, the Defending Our National Marine Sanctuaries from Damaging Chemicals Act. I want to thank my Florida colleague, Representative Mukersel-Powell, for co-sponsoring this legislation, and thank the members of this committee who have also co-sponsored it. This narrowly tailored bill, which may need to be more narrowly tailored according to the assertion about melanoma, which we can fix, prohibits the human use of oxybenzone and octinoxate near coral reefs in federal protected waters within the National Marine Sanctuary systems. This legislation does not restrict state or local governments in any way, and there are many safe and effective organic sunscreens which can substitute for the harmful products that contain these toxic chemicals. I just tried a few over the Christmas break. Coral reefs are the foundation of the marine ecosystem. The important nurturing of marine life and the fish that feed on them, which begin on our coral reefs, work through the entire biota, culminating with the large pelagics. Coral reefs also play a major role in preventing shore erosion and protecting coastal wetlands. Additionally, coral reefs are tourism resources. In South Florida alone, these reefs contribute significantly to an $8.5 billion a year tourist economy. This legislation will protect these critical components of our marine environment and assure that they can be enjoyed and studied for generations to come. We must act now to prevent the use of these harmful chemicals in our national marine sanctuaries. Tragically, in the last 3 decades, 2/3 of Florida's coral reefs have been lost. Here's a visual of what we call coral bleaching, which is it's basically a dead reef. While many factors may play a role in damaging our coral reefs, including acidification, rising seawater temperatures, and pollution, which creates hypoxic conditions and kills everything underneath it, we should also act now to stop these harmful chemicals because they play a role as well. There are plenty of effective and safe organic sunscreen products on the market today, and we can make sure and clean up that there's no suggestion that we're for melanoma or that kind, or against sunscreen. That's a great idea. And national companies are manufacturing these and selling them right now. Like I say, I tried some. Consumers have easy access to environmentally safe sunscreens. In closing, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and Representative Fulcher, and members of this committee, I want to thank you for considering H.R. 1834 and for your concern for protecting the marine environment in Florida and throughout the United States by banning these harmful, toxic chemicals. I yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rooney, for your leadership on this very important issue. To my Vice Chair, I forgot to ask unanimous consent that Ms. Dingle could join us on the dais. I hope that's agreeable without objection. Seeing no objection, it is so ordered, and we will now hear from Representative Dingle of Michigan to tell us about H.R. 2236, the Forage Fish Conservation Act. Welcome, Representative Dingle. The committee recognizes you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Vice Chair Mr. Fulcher, for convening this important hearing to discuss bipartisan legislation to strengthen our nation's fisheries. Forage fish, smaller fish that serve as prey for other recreationally and commercially important species, such as tuna, salmon, and cod, are vital for sustaining a healthy marine ecosystem. However, the numbers of many of these fish have declined dramatically in recent years, and they're now at historic lows. For example, coastwide landings of shad and river herring have fallen by more than 96% since 1950. Additionally, human demand for these fish species has continued to grow. These increased pressures, if not addressed soon, will threaten opportunities for recreational fishing as well as the larger marine ecosystem. To maintain healthy and abundant fisheries in the coming years, we must work to strengthen science-based mechanisms for fisheries management that build upon the success of Magnuson-Stevens and other proven conservation methods. This is why the Forage Fish Conservation Act is necessary. The legislation creates a national, scientific-based definition for forage fish in federal waters, ensures that scientific advice sought by fishery managers includes recommendations for forage fish, while preserving state management of forage fish fisheries that occur in their jurisdiction. Additionally, the legislation assesses the impact of any new commercial forage fish fishery could have on existing fisheries, fishing communities, and the marine ecosystem prior to the fishery being authorized. Taken together, the provisions in the Forage Fish Conservation Act would implement a consistent fisheries conservation policy throughout the 8 fishery management councils. This would allow Americans to enjoy healthier ecosystems that support thriving coastal communities, as well as their associated economies. The legislation has broad bipartisan support, as well as the backing of a variety of groups, including the American Sports Fishing Association, the National Marine Manufacturers Association, the National Wildlife Federation, the Pew Charitable Trust, and the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. I would also like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter signed by over 100 scientists from across the country supporting the Forage Fish Conservation Act. This is a tongue twister. The need for action is clear, as is not doing anything. By acting now, building upon the success of Magnuson-Stevens' proven state-based conservation mechanisms, we can address this pressing need for the benefit of our fishing communities and the economy at large. I want to thank my colleague, Congressman Brian Mast, for his leadership and support of this legislation as well, and look forward to continuing to work in a bipartisan manner to move the Forage Fish Conservation Act forward. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Representative Dingell. We will next hear from Representative Garrett Graves of Louisiana on the direct enhancement of snapper conservation and the economy through Novel Devices Act of 2019. The folks in the acronym department were working overtime on that one. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here today. I know you all were up late last night celebrating the big victory, and I appreciate y'all. I appreciate y'all all being here. I noticed that my friend from South Carolina is not here, and I also want to make note that he may have in the first quarter suggested that we double our bet. So he may be wearing a LSU jersey not one day this week, but twice. Oh, look, his staff just came in. Hi. Joe's going to be wearing a jersey twice this week. All right, so the bill. First, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for working with us on this legislation, on this bipartisan legislation. The quick story is that there are hundreds of thousands of pounds of red snapper, for example, that are wasted each year as a result of barotrauma. And what happens is these are deep fish. They are down at deep levels, reef fish, and whenever you pull them up, just like a scuba diver may get the bends from coming up too quickly, you have these fish, the bladder inflates, and these fish go through barotrauma and they perish. And what's happened, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, is these fish, they have, the numbers have really increased significantly. The population has increased significantly in recent years. So I can tell you as a fisher, I'll go down and go fish. You cannot avoid red snapper. You can't avoid them. And so if you're out of season, or if you're over limit, the limit's only 2 fish per person per day, then you bring a fish up and it is going to die unless you properly treat it. And so I know that you look at this and you say, oh, look, that's a bottle opener. And I get it. But I want to show you how this works. Mr. Chairman, open your mouth. This is one type of descend device, and you simply clip this into the fish's mouth. They have other types of devices. In fact, in Louisiana, because we're innovative, the folks have used milk crates. There's actually a venting tool you can use that looks somewhat like a straw. All sorts of options that are there to help to relieve the pressure or to release the fish back, just like a hyperbaric unit for a scuba diver, to release the fish back to the appropriate depth to where they once again experience the appropriate type of atmospheric pressure to where they do not perish as a result of barotrauma. So the legislation simply requires that the different types of tools are available on the vessel and ready to utilize. I've used these before, and again, many other types of options, incredibly inexpensive, and they do help to prevent these fish from perishing, and so it helps fish populations. Let me say it again. While the numbers, the data on this are not good, because, for example, in 2013, it's reported that the commercial sector ended up causing about 78 78,000 pounds of red snapper to go through barotrauma and to be lost. They say it was only 78,000 pounds in 2013, yet in 2014 they said it was 531,000 pounds. So there's way too much disparity in those numbers for them to be accurate. But in any case, they project that it's somewhere around an average of about 540,000 pounds per year of fish that would be given a chance at life if these were utilized in the commercial and rec sector. And so again, Mr. Chairman, I want to say thank you for working with us on this bipartisan legislation in this very partisan committee. It doesn't happen much, but I really do appreciate you and your staff working with us on this. So all you have to do, once again, you have to have them in the boat and ready to utilize. They're very easy to use. There are multiple ways that you can comply with the legislation. Mr. Chairman, lastly, I want to say that I have gone through the testimony from Noaa. I am disappointed in their response because I think that it lacks their own council's science. And so I'm looking forward to having some discussion about that because we've got to deal with facts here. And based on what I read in the testimony, it appeared that that was advised by someone who doesn't fish and doesn't understand how this actually works. We work with Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Partnerships. We work with the Gulf States. We work with CCA. We work with the American Sportfish Association and many others, and the Gulf Shareholder Alliance and many other stakeholders in this. And I'm looking forward to hearing more. Thank you. Yield back.
Well, thanks, Mr. Graves, for your good work on this bill, and you're going to have a chance to show me in person how this works at the end of this month. So looking forward to that. Before we hear from Mr. Cunningham, I will go ahead and jump in and talk about my two bills at this point. So in my district and throughout the Pacific Northwest, salmon obviously have great ecological, cultural, and economic importance. Protecting these populations now, before we damage their habitat and cause salmon crashes, is necessary in these areas of salmon abundance to make sure that these fish are around for the future, for tribes that have depended on them since time immemorial, for commercial fishermen who rely on healthy fisheries for their livelihoods, and for recreational anglers like me who like to get out on the water whenever possible and cast for salmon. So H.R. 4723, the Salmon-Focused Investments in Sustainable Habitats Act, or the Salmon Fish Act, seeks to identify core centers of salmon abundance and ensure that these areas receive the protection, support, and funding they need to continue sustaining thriving salmon populations. The concept behind this bill is simple. Let's identify the most pristine salmon habitats across the country and take steps to ensure the exceptional quality of this habitat is maintained. Restoring degraded habitat is also very important, but it's hard to do. Once you've messed a place up, it is often very hard to bring it back. My bill takes a different approach by proactively investing in the country's best salmon habitat and protecting these areas from becoming degraded in the first place. So to accomplish this, the bill directs Noaa and the Fish and Wildlife Service to work with other federal agencies, with tribes, states, NGOs, to identify core centers of salmon abundance, diversity, and productivity. We call these salmon conservation areas. And once a salmon conservation area has been identified, the area is prioritized for U.S. Forest Service road decommissioning. This bill doesn't call for any new decommissioning, but to the extent that the Forest Service itself has identified decommissioning opportunities, opportunities in these salmon conservation areas would have priority. And also, the bill supports actions in these areas being subject to serious review under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. The bill establishes a 5-year grant program as well to fund research, monitoring, and small restoration projects to give these already pristine areas the small boost they may need to maintain habitat quality and maximize the potential of these areas to sustain thriving populations. Lastly, the bill recognizes the good work that's already being done by agencies like the Forest Service and provides 5 years' worth of additional funding for existing watershed health programs that benefit salmon. We shouldn't wait around until salmon habitat is trashed in order to invest in restoration. That's what this bill is all about, proactively investing in high-quality habitat. It's a far less expensive, more efficient way to increase the resilience of our salmon populations instead of waiting until their habitat is lost or seriously degraded. I'd also like to take a moment to clarify the issue raised in Mr. Monet's testimony. I believe the ranking member referred to this as well. First, the testimony raised concerns about the Nepa language in the bill, and I have heard from other stakeholders about this language. I am working to revise this to make it absolutely clear that we are not presenting some, grave new uncertainty in the Nepa process. I think we can clarify that. Second, the testimony claimed that the bill could be interpreted to designate a watershed as a salmon conservation area, even if there are no salmon present. Obviously, that's not what we're trying to do with this bill. Another witness, Mr. Clifford from Trout Unlimited, describes the importance of the regionally significant language in his written testimony. But for now, I'd like to reiterate that the purpose of this bill is to protect areas where salmon populations are thriving, and if necessary, I will clarify this language in the bill. Next, I'd like to speak to H.R. 5548, the Fishery Fund Act. I'm proud to lead this bipartisan bill with my colleagues, Representative Palazzo, Kilmer, and Herrera Butler, and I appreciate the work of Senator Wicker and his colleagues leading this in the Senate. It's an important step for communities in my district, but also throughout the country, who have suffered not only due to fisheries disasters, but due to the impacts of delayed disaster relief under a very slow, bureaucratic, and frustrating process. This bill would clarify the disaster request process by specifying criteria used for evaluating requests, eligible uses of relief funding, and also specifying the information required for disaster requests and spend plans. If we do that, everyone will be on the same page and can work through the process much more efficiently. Perhaps most importantly, the bill would make sure the federal fishery disaster relief program works the way it is supposed to, by setting timelines to ensure federal agencies are responding to impacted communities faster than what we have seen in the past. It shouldn't take several years to get this done, and my bill aims to change that. On the north coast of California, for example, we've seen how ocean heat waves, domoic acid blooms, and drought have led to devastating consequences for our most important fisheries. Unfortunately, it is likely that we haven't seen the last of our fisheries disasters. There will be more. And especially with climate change, it is critical that we help fishing communities and tribes when these disasters happen. So I want to thank Vice Chairman Myers of the Yurok tribe, who's here to testify, also Mr. Clifford for being here to testify on these two bills. Look forward to hearing from the witnesses. And we will take Mr. Cunningham out of order when he arrives to talk about his bill. But at this point, we will go to our administration witness. So please come forward, and we want to welcome back to the subcommittee Rear Admiral Timothy Gallaudet. Admiral Gallaudet is Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and Deputy NOAA Administrator. He oversees the wet side of NOAA's programs, which includes oceans, coasts, and fisheries. He previously served for 32 years in the U.S. Navy, most recently as oceanographer of the Navy. So thank you for your service, Rear Admiral Gallaudet. You heard my statement to the other witnesses about how the time and the lights work. You've been here before, so I won't repeat all of that. So with that, I recognize Rear Admiral Gallaudet to testify for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today regarding several ocean bills. NOAA celebrates its 50th anniversary this year. We are proud of our rich history in ocean and coastal monitoring, mapping, prediction, resource management, and conservation. These elements of NOAA's mission support a growing American blue economy, and they were significantly promoted during the White House Summit on Ocean Science and Technology Partnerships in November and in the subsequent Presidential Memorandum on Ocean Mapping of the U.S. EEZ and shoreline and nearshore of Alaska. Under the Trump administration, NOAA has been a proactive champion for America's National Marine Sanctuary System. We designated our newest National Marine Sanctuary in 2 decades at Mallows Bay on the Potomac River last year, and we have prioritized expanding 3 existing sanctuaries and designating 2 new ones over this next year. We agree that coral reef conservation is an important aspect of several sanctuaries demonstrated via sanctuary management plans, which are reviewed every 5 years through a well-established stakeholder-driven process. And for this reason, we oppose the prescriptive approach taken in the bill concerning sanctuaries and sunscreen chemicals. Regarding H.R. 2236, forage fish, NOAA believes it could circumvent the council process under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. and we do not see a need for additional legislation. Noaa recognizes the importance of forage fish to maintaining healthy marine ecosystems, and we agree in principle that ecosystem impact should be a consideration in the management of forage fish. Under MSA, the Fishery Management Councils already have sufficient authority to manage forage fish and account for ecosystem impacts. Multiple councils have developed varied management strategies for forage fish, including the Mid-Atlantic, Pacific, and North Pacific Councils. The MSA established a stakeholder-driven, scientifically based council process that allows for regionally specific solutions to forage fish issues. Therefore, we oppose this legislation. Similarly, the Climate Ready Fisheries Act requires GAO to examine efforts by the councils, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and NOAA to prepare and adapt fishery management plans for the impacts of climate change. In many circumstances, we are already undertaking the provisions of this act. NOAA agreed with the implemented recommendations from a similar GAO study, and we continue to work with partners to understand and respond to changing climate and ocean conditions. Also, as part of the White House summit I mentioned earlier, NOAA announced the release for public comment of 4 science and technology strategies that will improve fishery stock assessments. These technologies include autonomous or unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, omics, and cloud computing. Improved stock assessments will help fisheries managers better adapt to climate change. And regarding the Fish Act, NOAA agrees that salmon species throughout the nation face daunting challenges such as habitat degradation, loss, and competing land and water use demands. We welcome the interest from Congress to improve support for salmon conservation and to help sustain healthy salmon populations and the communities that depend on them. NOAA understands that the Descend Act requires fishermen to use descending devices and venting tools for conservation when targeting reef species in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf Council strongly encourages the use of these tools when appropriate. NOAA agrees such tools, when appropriately used, could increase the survivability of released fish. However, we are concerned there is not sufficient science to support the broad application of these tools or requirements to all species. The Gulf Council repealed a rule that required venting tools for reef fish after determining that regulation was more harmful than anticipated. NOAA recommends the Council be afforded the opportunity to implement any new policies or requirements through MSA's stakeholder-driven process to ensure they are informed by the latest science and to effectively achieve the bill's objective. NOAA has worked to ensure fishery disaster determinations are evaluated under the current provisions of the MSA and in a consistent and timely manner. We also strive to ensure disaster assistance is allocated as effectively and quickly as possible. However, we do see the potential improvements in both, as currently they take too long. We are developing regulations to streamline and improve our work. H.R. 5548 provides an overarching framework, and many of its provisions are consistent with or expand upon our current fishery disaster policy. The expansion of scope, potential duplication with other disaster assistance programs, and the accompanying analytical requirements may pose implementation and timing difficulties in this bill. However, NOAA supports the action taken in this bill regarding many of the concerns identified. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today.
Thank you, Rear Admiral. I will begin by asking you about some of the salmon issues that we have been talking about here this morning. As I highlighted in my statement, communities suffer for years when they've experienced a fishery disaster, and this is on top, obviously, of the serious impact that the disaster itself visits upon these communities and tribal cultures. And I know that some of this delay in getting the relief is because of a significant back and forth between requesters and the agency. So I wonder if you could elaborate on how the explicit guidelines in my bill will help both impacted communities who need to get this relief, but also your agency to navigate the bureaucracy of getting this relief out the door.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We agree. We need to streamline the process and make it quicker and more responsive, and that's why in the rules that we are developing as we speak, we would be doing just that in support of the communities and stakeholders you mentioned. We believe by the rulemaking process, we can include the stakeholders' input, unlike, I think, the legislative approach.
So I want to ask you now about climate change, and I certainly appreciate that you did utter the words changing climate in your testimony. That is what passes for boldness in this administration, so I'm grateful for that. But it is hard to reconcile any stated commitment to addressing climate change, especially from a critical agency like yours where the climate is at the center of your mission, with the actions that this administration has been taking across the board, most recently with its efforts to undermine the National Environmental Policy Act and ignore and actually mandate ignoring the impact that federal actions have on the global climate crisis. I feel strongly enough about this that I've included the text of Representative Cunningham's bill, which directs a very important study on climate change and fisheries management in my Fishery Fund Act, because climate change, everybody in the fishery world, everybody who makes their living on the water understands that this is a real thing and that it's already been linked to fisheries disasters. So these issues have to be discussed in the same conversation. Let me ask you specifically, what is Noaa doing under your watch to increase resiliency in fisheries management and ensure that fishing-dependent communities are better prepared for climate change-driven disasters?
Thank you, Chairman Huffman. Noaa is doing a great deal to help our fishery management councils adapt to climate change. In fact, our Noaa Fisheries office has a climate science strategy they've developed, and under that strategy, they've developed regional action plans, 4 of them, and to support those plans, they've performed 8 ecosystem status reports and are conducting 4 climate variability assessments for various stocks all around the country, and we'll do about 3 more this year. And so we're looking at the problem and informing the councils in a very deliberate, dedicated, thoughtful, and professional way.
All right, and in terms of getting funding appropriated, it's a huge part of the delay that we've experienced, sometimes 2, 3, 4 years before we can run all the way through the appropriations process and the OMB process and get the funding to these impacted communities. Has your agency explored any ideas about alternative or supplemental strategies for disaster relief that could be more effective?
Thank you, Chairman. To the best of my knowledge, no, but I'd have to, I can get back with your staff and let you know if that's otherwise.
Okay, I appreciate that. Just very quickly moving on to the Salmon Fish Act. Obviously, Noaa Fisheries' mission is to recover and conserve protected resources, including our iconic salmon populations. How would this bill complement NOAA's existing programs and support salmon conservation?
Thank you again, Chairman. Well, we do a great deal to protect endangered and threatened species of salmon on the West Coast and really all around the country. In fact, just recently, our Office of Habitat in the Noaa Fisheries performed a habitat restoration effort in California that has protected and promoted salmon. So that's one aspect. We also have a habitat focus area in the Russian River in your great state. And in fact, some of our work has also supported the restoral of the West Coast groundfish fishery with provisions in a recent rule that will eliminate bycatch of salmon. So we have a great deal of work underway to protect habitat and ensure the conservation of salmon.
Thank you. And just very quickly, some of the work you just mentioned is doing good things for salmon, and we do appreciate it, but I think you also are alluding to the recent biological opinion in the Central Valley of California, which I would not categorize as a great action to protect salmon. In fact, we know that your scientists produced a jeopardy ruling in the initial draft of that biological opinion. They were overridden by a politically riddled mockery of a scientific process to produce a no jeopardy finding. This is exactly how you don't protect salmon from going extinct. So please don't include that in your list of accomplishments for salmon anywhere. But also let's include strongholds, since my bill focuses on strongholds like Bristol Bay, Alaska. I know you realize that that's the world's last great salmon stronghold, sockeye salmon in particular, and the Pebble Mine has been a huge focus of my efforts to protect salmon here in the Congress. We would love to see Noaa fully participate in that process. It has not been a full participant for reasons that we still don't quite understand. Such a vital question for salmon protection, and yet Noaa is not at the table. We'd like to see that change going forward, and I look forward to working with you in that regard. With that, I will recognize, who would you like to go to, Russ?
Probably me first.
All right, I'll recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Rear Admiral, what's the appropriate pronunciation of your name? Is it Gallaudet, Gallaudet?
It's a Gallaudet, Ranking Member.
Gallaudet, thank you. Sensitive to name mispronunciation, so we appreciate you very much. Thanks for being here. In regard to 1834, could you just be a little bit more specific for me on some of the data? What's the data that you've referenced, scientific data, that justifies the banning of these sunscreens? And anything you have or you can share in terms of sourcing, dates, that type of thing would really be helpful.
Yes, Ranking Member Fulcher. There is overwhelming scientific evidence for the toxicity of these two chemicals under question on coral reefs and various species of marine life. So the science is well proven, and as I stated before, our objection to this draft bill has nothing to do with the science. It has to do with the fact that the National Marine Sanctuaries system has a well-proven stakeholder-driven process of review that we think would satisfy the intent of this legislation.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I've got a couple of letters here. One is from the Public Access Sunscreens Coalition. One is from the Personal Care Products Council. If I may, I would ask unanimous consent to enter those into the public record, if I may.
Without objection.
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Gallaudet, thank you for that. If I could do a follow-up on regarding 4679. You laid out in your testimony that efforts the National Marine Fisheries Services and the councils have taken to date to address climate-related impacts on the nation's fisheries. You noted the GAO study that has already been conducted, which made recommendations to Noaa to address climate-related issues, and which NMF has agreed and implemented. So is it fair to say the study, of course we haven't gotten to this, but this is Mr. Cunningham's bill, isn't it? Sorry, I'm out of order on that. Sorry about that.
We're still talking about it.
So, but actually you are providing some testimony on that. So is it fair to say that this study is redundant? Could you speak to that a little bit, please?
Ranking Member Fulcher, that's our assessment.
And can councils currently take climate into consideration when formulating fishery management plans?
They have and they are. Yes, sir.
Okay, that's it for me, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Case, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Admiral. I'd like to focus on H.R. 1834, Mr. Rooney's bill, which I'm a very happy co-sponsor of. And before I get to a couple of questions, I would like to cite for the record 2 letters that I have, one from my colleagues in the Hawaii State Legislature and the Hawaii Coral Reef Stakeholders, which is a public-private group that focuses on the health of our coral reefs in Hawaii, and another one from the Friends of Hanauma Bay, both advocating for the passage of H.R. 1834, and ask unanimous consent to enter these into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Admiral, let me focus on these bills which would ban 2 sunscreens in our national marine sanctuaries. And as you've already pointed out correctly, the evidence is overwhelming that these sunscreens do in fact harm our marine life. What is left a little bit out in the testimony thus far is that it's not just corals that we're talking about, the effects on corals, but effectively these sunscreens not only affect corals, but the lower level fish and marine life in our food chain and all the way up. So this is a biomagnifying agent of harm in our coral reefs and our marine environments. And to take a very specific example, I spoke about the Friends of Hanauma Bay. Hanauma Bay is a beautiful bay on the island of Oahu that is part of the Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary. And that bay receives 1 million visitors plus per year. It has actually been a protected marine preserve under state law since the 60s, one of the very first in our country. It's a magnificent asset, but it has been damaged by sunscreen over the years. And as a result, Hawaii passed the first law of its kind in our country a state law which actually does ban the use of certain sunscreens. Now, it's a little too early to see the scientific evidence, but anecdotally, there has been a real recovery in Hanauma Bay in the year plus that we have seen the sunscreen ban in effect. And so I don't think that there's any doubt that these sunscreens are harmful to marine life, and I don't think there's any scientific doubt that eliminating these sunscreens would be beneficial to our marine life. And in fact, Noaa recognizes this exact fact on your website. The National Ocean Service very correctly and rightly and admirably goes into great lengths about how we all can protect our coral reefs. After citing various scientific studies, you have on your site this kind of closing remark: how we can protect ourselves and our marine life. Choose sunscreens with chemicals that don't harm marine life. So I guess with all of that, I'm having trouble with your basic premise that we should leave this matter to the stakeholders. And I would ask you two questions. First of all, if it's so well demonstrated and if there's precedent out there that actually indicates it's working, why not just cut to the chase and just say you can't do it in our marine sanctuaries, number one. And number two, since you place a lot of value in the stakeholder system, has in fact the stakeholder system resulted in a recommendation in any of the marine sanctuaries to ban sunscreens from the use in those sanctuaries? Has that been implemented in any of our sanctuaries to date?
Thank you, Congressman Case. First off, I have dove Hanauma Bay and snorkeled there and dove many reefs in your great state. And our coral reef conservation program does wonderful things all around the country and our territories to protect and preserve our corals. The question you've asked about regarding have we implemented any kind of ban or found a reason to do so yet is we have not. But again, as I mentioned, we have these 5-year reviews. One most, I think, very representative of the issues here is the restoration blueprint in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary that was just issued. And this is their newest management plan to get after the declining and reef system there that are suffering from stony coral tissue loss disease. And this is a very aggressive plan, and it's been a lot of hard work and science behind it. And so I really applaud our National Marine Sanctuary System in how they do this, working with stakeholders, making sure it's science-based. And so I'd say that even though we haven't yet found a reason to ban through the process sunscreen chemicals, we've been able to show around the country restoration and conservation successes with an added STEM education and outreach benefit. I could go into detail and I'd be happy to brief your staff at a later time on those wins.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Over the objection of the Clemson fans in the committee, I'll recognize Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Who's a Clemson fan? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few things. Number one, I need to correct the record, first of all. I said earlier that it was 74,000 pounds and 540,000 pounds, and it's actually fish. I apologize. I screwed that up. So it makes it even more significant. So 74,000 fish was the low end of, I believe, the commercial estimates, and then the average for both commercial and recreation was 540,000 fish. And so let me just be clear. The whole concept behind this bill, Mr. Chairman, as you well know because you are a co-sponsor, is that if we can take very easy actions to comply with and allow fishers to help improve the sustainability of species, it will actually increase the ability to catch fish. And so estimates indicate that we could actually increase the catch shares or the harvested fish each year to the tune of 8.5% if these devices are used and these barotrauma deaths are eliminated. And even with half of the fish being saved, it would allow the catch shares to increase by 4.5%. So we are talking substantial numbers. Admiral, in your testimony, you say a few things. And look, I'll look at this like constructive feedback, but let me remind you, we have a bipartisan bill in the House, including from the committee. We have a bipartisan bill in the Senate. I would look at that like something you need to work with as opposed to getting in the way of, because I would suggest that anyone standing in the way of this may have tire tracks on them at some point. And I think it'd be better if we could figure out how to do this. So the testimony says that that Noaa, or the Fisheries Management Council, encourages the use of these tools. It says that that you're concerned about defining the descending device in the legislation. Well, the definition that's used is actually the definition by the council. It's the definition that the council has established already. So we're using their definition. I believe we did it word for word. Yeah, word for word. So number one. Number two, the testimony expresses concern that descending devices may work on some species and may not on others, including triggerfish, expressing concern that on triggerfish it may not work. Well, under the legislation, the council actually decides which species it applies to. So I do think that maybe there's a little bit of a disconnect here. I want to make sure we're working together. I don't have a desire to ram this down anybody's throat, but I do have a desire to make sure that this works. When you talk 540,000 fish annually, an average number with clear underreporting, that's a big deal, and we need to fix it. So if you have any feedback on that or want to come back, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but we need to work together on this.
Thank you, Congressman Graves. And as a former Louisiana resident, I'll just say, go Tigers.
Yeah.
But no, we want the same thing. And in fact, that's demonstrated by the new management approach we've done for red snapper in the Gulf. And that's succeeding. And I think all the Gulf states are benefiting. And we want to ensure that our fish stocks are sustainably fished and not overfished, and we can conserve those for the next generation. And so we did in the testimony cite some technical issues and concerns that we believe would be fairly difficult to implement a regulation on these devices, knowing that the technology continues to evolve and knowing that they're useful for some species in some situations, but not universally. So we would be happy to work with you on improving the language and ensuring, as I said, that we ensure we abide by the stakeholder-driven, science-based process of the council through the MSA.
Thank you, Admiral. I want to remind you that the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council is actually implementing mandatory use right now. So there clearly is a way to do this. I think the chairman, myself, and your folks, we can get together and figure out how to make sure that we have the appropriate sideboards on the bill. I want to ask that we do that sooner than later because with the chairman's blessing, I certainly would like to move this bill as quickly as possible. I think it's a good bipartisan conservation opportunity for us to improve species sustainability and access to fisheries. So I'd appreciate that. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I just want to very quickly note on H.R. 5548, your bill on fisheries disaster declaration. Number one, I fully agree that process can be improved. I fully agree that it can. Number two, I know that some of this was motivated by some of the diversion issues that occurred as a result of the high water on the Mississippi River this year. I remind you that Noaa still was able to actually declare a fisheries disaster declaration under current law. Number three, it is somewhat confounding to me that we need to be thoughtful about this moving forward. We're talking about providing disaster assistance to folks for a resource that's owned by the public and they didn't pay for in many cases. And I think that I've supported fisheries disaster declarations in the past. I will continue to do it for the people that we represent, but I do think we need to be thoughtful about the right policy on how we do this moving forward. So I look forward to working with you on this. Yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Graves, and I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about that as the Magnuson reauthorization issue ripens in the months ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record December 2nd, 2019 letter signed by American Sportfish Association, Angler Action Foundation, Boat U.S., Center for Sports Fishing Policy, CCA, Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, National Marine Manufacturers Association, and others.
Reading very fast. This sounds like the side effects of a pharmaceutical commercial you hear at the end. All right, with that, I recognize Mr. Costa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the purpose of this hearing, and I think the proposed legislation that is part of this discussion is important, and I think there are areas that could enhance our ability to improve fisheries, salmon fisheries specifically as it relates to the challenges that we face, certainly in California and elsewhere. I agree with our colleague's comments a moment ago in which he said we need to be thoughtful about this approach, because I think it is important that we try to figure out the science as we understand it, and how we try to figure out using all the tools available for restoration purposes to achieve success. Having been engaged in fishery restoration in California for many years, and knowing the challenges that go with it. Admiral, I'd like to ask you, given your own background and your sense, and I know you were talking about other fisheries with relationships to the Gulf and to the East Coast and elsewhere, how comfortable you feel about talking about the challenges that we face on salmon habitat and restoration purposes on the West Coast and California particularly?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. As I said before, I'm very proud of Noaa Fisheries and the work it has done to restore and salmon habitat and conserve various endangered and threatened species. But I'm also proud of their ability to balance the needs of water users in the West and meet the
So you feel comfortable about talking about the specific nature of the challenges we face in California?
Yes, I do, Congressman.
Okay. The historical jurisdiction that exists between Noaa and NIMS and the ability to try to work through those issues and in ways that are collaborative, where would you say they are today as juxtaposed to 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
I think, Congressman, that we have raised the level or upped the game in terms of collaboration between the various water agencies in a way that's never been seen before. We have established an interagency water sub-cabinet that's composed of below secretary level leadership. So it includes EPA, it includes myself for NOAA, and it includes USDA, Army Corps of Engineers, and the Department of Interior's Bureau of Reclamation. And
So how do you see that process working?
we have the presidential memorandum on water in the West requires some very specific actions by dates, and we meet just about monthly to make sure we can resolve any potential conflicts or impasses.
And everybody's at the
implementing those
table.
projects. Yes, sir.
And what do you see are the clear and present challenges facing in trying to make determinations with different overlapping responsibilities and jurisdictions?
Congressman, as you mentioned and as you say, that's it. Is you have competing interests and potentially either overlapping or actually gaps between the various agencies' responsibilities, and that's why we've made it an imperative to meet regularly and have a dedicated group with a formal charter.
Do you think we're using the best science available?
Congressman, I think we are using the best science available.
And is there consensus among that, not only with NOAA, but with NIMS and the other agencies that you cited in that sit at this round table, for lack of a better term, every month?
Congressman, I have been a scientist since I graduated from my undergraduate program at the Annapolis, and so there will always be lively scientific debate.
Well, no, that's part of it. There should be.
But no, I think within the agencies currently, there's more consensus than there's ever been.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you on this legislation. I think it's got good intentions, and we'll continue to have the discussion, and I look forward to the next panel. Thank you very much, Admiral, for your service to our country.
Appreciate that. And Rear Admiral, we thank you for your testimony. We will now let you go and bring forward our next panel. So I will begin introducing those witnesses as they I'll invite them to go ahead and start coming forward, taking their seats. First witness we'll hear from is a constituent of mine. It's Vice Chairman Frankie Myers of the Yurok tribe in Klamath, California. I saw him raise his eyebrow when it was just stated that everyone's at the table on that water management process, because I don't think he's at the table. But we'll hear from him. Our next witness will be Mr. Matthew Clifford, a staff attorney for the California Water Project at Trout Unlimited. Following him, we will hear from Ms. Kelly Ralston, the Southeast Fisheries Policy Director for the American Sport Fishing Association. And then our last witness will be Mr. Andre Monit, Managing Partner of the firm Best and Krieger. So let me remind the witnesses again that under our committee rules, they should limit their oral statements to 5 minutes. The entire written statement you have will be entered into the record. And when you begin, of course, the light will be green. At the 1 minute point, it'll turn yellow. And when it turns red, I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will allow the entire panel to testify before we bring it back to members for their questions. So the chair now recognizes Vice Chairman Myers. Welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Welcome. I'm going to start with our traditional prayer. Walk one a year next week in Walk one a year goes chat. Squeeze me get tossed for Kiko and new man. Oh, walk one a year. Walk. Ayukui, Squeenakoi, Chairman, Vice Chairman, distinguished committee members, I'm pleased to be here today to testify in support of H.R. 5548, the Fisheries Fund Act. Numi Notik gone. Long time ago, there was a time of great famine in the Klamath River. Pulukakwerik and Wapekamau had came back to Earth to check on how the people were doing, and they started at the mouth of the river in the village of Rakoi, and they made their way up through Watek and Pekwa and Tregon, Kennek and Witchpek, even up towards the river, towards the villages of Penamnik and Kadameen. Everywhere they went, they heard the same story, that the people were starving, that there was no food, that there was no salmon in the river. Salmon in Yurok is nepui, and the literal translation is what we eat. As Pulukokwerik and Wapekama went on, they found the salmon had been held in the lakes in the upper basin, and they had, through various means of trickery as they do, was able to bring the salmon back down the river and teach the people how to ensure that the salmon would always be there in abundance. And until lately, that was true. There was been abundant salmon runs on the Klamath, although now that's changing. Having said that, we commend the committee and the subcommittee for its work on this bill. Our country needs to support America's fishing families in this time of crisis, just like our country supports farmers and families in other industries. Since time immemorial, the Yurok people have always fished the nation's largest salmon fishery. Unfortunately, the Klamath River salmon runs over the last 4 years have been the lowest on record. The Yurok tribe has declared a fisheries disaster for the last 3 years. My community is in crisis, and we need your assistance now more than ever. Traditionally, the Klamath River has always been the primary economy for the Yurok people. The Klamath River historically was the third largest salmon-producing river on the West Coast. One estimate is prior to non-Indian settlement, over 2 million pounds of salmon were consumed by tribes in the Klamath Basin, with runs well over 500,000. In the creation of the Yurok Reservation in 1855, the Yurok people reserved their Aboriginal rights to continue a fishing way of life, vesting in the tribe federally reserved fishing rights for commercial, subsistence, and ceremonial purposes. The federal government has a trust responsibility to protect our fishing rights in our way of life. The Yurok tribe operates a commercial fishery at the mouth of the Klamath River, which is highly regulated and monitored by the Yurok tribal government. We only harvest salmon when it's sustainable to do so. Despite having a legal right to fish since 1855, we have only had 3 meaningful years of commercial fishery opportunities because our rights were either protested or there was no fish to be caught. My parents fought for our fish and our right to fish. It's our generation's responsibility to protect those salmon and our ability to harvest them. The fight is important now more than ever. The last 4 years of returning Klamath salmon runs have been the smallest in recorded history, nearing a meager 1,200 in 2017. The cause of the fisheries collapse is 4 dams on the Klamath River, along with the Bureau of Reclamation's operating the Klamath Reclamation projects to support agriculture over the health of the river. As a result of the fisheries collapse, the tribal government declared fisheries disasters for 2016, 17, and 18, and we're now preparing for 2019. We estimate the closure of the fishery was an economic loss of $44 million. While that may not seem like much for a community whose annual income is $11,000, it's catastrophic. But those numbers pale in comparison to the loss of our ability to harvest for subsistence. This bill takes important steps to address programmatic issues in the fisheries disaster relief. First, it furthers the United States government's trust responsibility to Indian nations by authorizing tribal subsistence fishers to receive disaster relief funding. Second, the bill imposes reasonable timeframes for both Noaa and the fisheries communities to process and receive fisheries disaster relief funding. Includes specific timeframes is important for our communities to understand and to move forward. Third, it directs funding to fishers. In the past, there was a preference for grant proposals that included vocational training for fisheries over direct compensation to fisher people. This requirement is inappropriate. Yurok is a fishing community. The tribal government has invested millions of dollars in restoring the Klamath River. Our members have invested millions in fishing fleets and gear. For example, farmers in our basin have received $70 million in drought relief in the past 10 years, while Yurok has received a meager $4.4 million. Fisher people deserve equal as farmers.
Mr. Vice Chairman, I'm going to give you a little more time when it comes to my questions, but if it's okay, we'll pick up where you left off there in just a few minutes. I thank you for your testimony, and the committee now recognizes Mr. Clifford for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and subcommittee members. Thank you for the invitation to testify in support of H.R. 4723, the Salmon-Focused Investments in Sustainable Habitats, or FISH Act. My name is Matt Clifford, and I'm a senior policy advisor for Trout Unlimited's California Water Project, which is based in our San Francisco Bay Area office. I offer the following comments on behalf of TU's more than 300,000 members and supporters nationwide. First of all, we're very glad to see Congress once again take up the idea of greater investment in salmon and steelhead stronghold areas. Despite their widespread decline, these species have enormous commercial, recreational, and cultural value to the people of the western states and the nation, and restoring their habitat is a major focus of TU's work. In the course of that work, something that we've seen, and I'll echo the opening comments of Chairman Huffman here, is an understandable tendency for restoration dollars to be steered towards the hotspot watersheds where habitat's already been degraded and fish populations are on the brink. But the science tells us we can't restore salmon and steelhead populations by focusing on those areas alone. Rather, we must also invest in those watersheds that still support healthy runs of fish. And that's both to keep those areas from becoming the next hotspots, but also to provide a reservoir of fish that helps repopulate nearby watersheds as they are restored and returned to health. Very important concept. Over the years, TU has worked with allies like California Trout and the Nature Conservancy and others to support bills to designate and invest in salmon strongholds. While those efforts have not yet resulted in federal legislation, they have proved to be highly influential at the state level. So I'd like to provide 2 examples of how the state of California's identification of strongholds has already enabled TU and partners to create successful examples of restoration on the ground. The South Fork of the Eel River is one of the major salmon and steelhead producing rivers on California's north coast. Following the identification of this watershed as a stronghold, TU aggressively pursued restoration projects there, and in doing that, we partnered with a lot of the same timber companies we were already working with, nearby in the Mendocino coast. Some of these companies' predecessors, they logged in ways that modern companies would never consider in this day and age. But the land is now coming back under their stewardship, and their land now contains some of the best remaining habitat. So our work in that stronghold further reinforces the long-term value of the habitat, but at the same time, The companies also see value in the work. They see it as, because maintaining fish populations as a hedge against further regulation is in their interests. And it's also a way for them, they see it as a way to help keep the land in production over the long term. So a second example is our work with agricultural irrigators on Deer Creek in the foothills of the northern Sierra Nevada range, the northern Central Valley. In 2014, at the dawn of the worst drought in California's modern history, we began working with these operators to upgrade diversion dams to ensure that fish could migrate past them to reach the stronghold habitat upstream, where they're spawning and rearing habitat. At the same time, we're also working with these operators to improve the efficiency of their irrigation systems to allow them to leave more water instream for fish while still meeting their own agricultural needs. Once again, these projects strengthen the long-term value of that upstream stronghold habitat, but they also provide these partners with a hedge against increased regulation down the road, and they increase the effectiveness of their own operations. So both these examples are truly win-win situations. Again, I think these examples provide a good idea of the kind of benefits that the Fish Act could produce across the western United States within the salmon range. So turning to the bill itself, we think that the Fish Act's basic two-pronged approach of first designating strongholds using the best science and then using those designations to guide investment and planning decisions is a sound one. We also like that the bill establishes two different tiers of designations, salmon conservation areas and strongholds. This strikes us as a useful concept that could be used to provide appropriate levels of protection to different areas based on their size and their local characteristics. So we look forward to help strengthening the bill as it moves forward. In particular, it will be important to ensure that the designation of strongholds is accompanied by a robust and transparent public process. More often than not, the people who live and work in a region are also the best people to design good conservation programs. Meaningful state and local consultation will give stakeholders the chance to help shape what the stronghold concept looks like on the ground, allowing them to build on the work that's already been done before, including in states like California, who've already done quite a bit of work in this area. So in closing, I want to thank you again for your attention to this important issue and for considering our views on the Fish Act. We look forward to continuing to work with the committee as the bill moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clifford. The chair now recognizes Ms. Ralston for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, subcommittee members. On behalf of the American Sport Fishing Association, I'm honored to have been asked to testify before the House Committee on Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife regarding several important bills impacting marine resources and the recreational fishing community. Recreational fishing is truly an all-American activity. Our fisheries resources, which are held in the public trust and conserved through sound laws and policies, are envied the world over. Nearly 50 million people go fishing each year in the U.S., supporting over 800,000 jobs and contributing $125 billion to the nation's economy. None of this fishing participation would be possible without healthy and abundant fisheries resources. As ASA's past president, Mike Nussman, would often say, most recreational fishermen aren't any good, myself included, so there needs to be a lot of fish out there for us to have a fighting chance. We are grateful that the committee is considering several bills that will build upon current policies and adapt to new challenges to help ensure the conservation of the nation's marine resources for the benefit of all those who enjoy them. The recreational fishing community has long advocated for efforts to conserve forage fish, the suite of smaller fish that provide much of the food for sport fish. The Forage Fish Conservation Act would implement important considerations for forage fish in the Magnuson-Stevens Act. As these integral parts of the marine food web may become targeted for commercial exploitation, it is critically important that forage fish management accounts for their role in marine ecosystems. While some have argued that 1, the bill's definition is too broad, 2, nothing in current law prohibits federal efforts to conserve forage fish, and/or 3, that data is lacking to implement the bill, my written testimony goes into detail clarifying 1, how the scope of the definition is appropriate, 2, that current efforts to conserve forage fish are limited due to a lack of statutory authority and guidance, and 3, the feasibility of implementing the bill based on the best available information. While ASA welcomes constructive input on how to refine the bill to avoid potential unintended consequences or unnecessary workloads, we stand strong in our belief that the fundamental purposes of the bill are sound and are in the best interest of the nation and all those who rely on the marine environment. Switching to the Descend Act, as this committee is well aware, Gulf of Mexico red snapper has arguably been the most politically controversial fish in the nation over the last decade. Thanks to the leadership of the current administration and congressional leaders like Senator Richard Shelby and Representative Garrett Graves, substantial progress has been made in addressing this seemingly intractable issue and providing recreational Gulf red snapper fishermen with reasonable and responsible fishing access. Despite these successes, there are still challenges related to Gulf red snapper management that need to be addressed, including that of discard mortality. Due to the rapid change in pressure from being brought to the surface from depth, many red snapper and other reef fish cannot swim back down and end up dying at the surface, as Congressman Graves gave you the numbers earlier. As a result, hundreds of thousands of red snapper are wasted each year in the Gulf. Given the importance of this species to the region's economy and culture, the many years of hard work and sacrifices by fishermen to rebuild the fishery, and the millions of dollars put toward Gulf red snapper research, management, and conservation, it is our collective responsibility to minimize wasteful discard mortality of the stock. By requiring those targeting reef fish in the Gulf possess descending devices, and by clarifying that oil spill recovery funds can be used for related projects, which has been a primary roadblock prohibiting regulatory action by the Council, the Descend Act would be a tremendous step towards reducing wasteful discard mortality and ensuring the sustainability of the iconic Gulf red snapper and other reef fish. ASA also supports the Climate Ready Fisheries Act of 2019 to identify current approaches and future needs related to the management and scientific challenges of climate change on our nation's marine fisheries. And we also support the Fishery Fund Act. The Fishery Disaster Assistance Program has been critical to help recreational fishing dependent businesses recover in the wake of numerous disasters. The Fishery Fund Act would better include the recreational fishing industry in the disaster declaration process and expedite the delivery of relief dollars. We ask that the committee continue to work with the sport fishing industry to ensure that the bill clearly and sufficiently incorporates all relevant aspects of recreational fishing. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide the sport fishing industry's perspective on these important bills.
Thank you, Ms. Ralston. The chair now recognizes Mr. Monit for 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to provide input on the Salmon-Focused Investments in Sustainable Habitats, or Salmon Fish Act. My name is Andre Monit. As noted, I'm an attorney with the law firm of Best & Krieger. I want to correct the record. I have the privilege of serving as the managing partner of the Washington, D.C. office, not the entire firm. So I appreciate the promotion, but I unfortunately wouldn't want to hold myself out that way. I've spent my career working on water supply and water quality issues for clients primarily in the American West. And those clients include farmers and cities and public agencies that provide water supply and sewage treatment services. And so my testimony today is my own. No one's asked me to come. Obviously, I'm a guest of the committee, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity for input. I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody in particular. But my testimony is certainly informed by my work with those clients and on those issues. And so what are those issues? Really, it's one issue, and it's a fundamental one. It's water. Water is among the most important things we have in society. Without it, it's the backbone of our agricultural system, of our economy. Without it, we have very little. And the water supply and delivery system we've built in the Western United States is a marvel. It's unprecedented in history. And it provides the economic engine that allows the great cities of the West to thrive. And if that went away, the economies that are based on that would go away. California has, for example, has the 5th largest economy in the world. Without the water to fuel that economy, I don't imagine what that would look like. It probably wouldn't be as large. So again, to that point, it's important that Congress consider the impacts to water infrastructure when adopting legislation. And that brings us to the Fish Act. We've looked at this act, I've looked at this act, and it's proposing to do, really, in my mind, 3 things. First of all, designate salmon conservation areas, and within that, the salmon strongholds. Secondly, I think very importantly, provide grants for salmon habitat restoration. And third, make an amendment to Nepa. I think the bill itself has very good intentions. Providing grants, federal grants for habitat restoration is something that really isn't very controversial, I don't think, so that most people welcome. But as always, devil's in the details. And there are aspects of the bill that Chairman Huffman, that you mentioned at the beginning, that we really appreciate. We are concerned about, the royal we, I, as someone who follows water issues. And those involve the scope of the salmon conservation areas as described in the legislation. And then, of course, the proposed Nepa amendment. So I'll start with the scope of the salmon conservation areas. The bill as proposed does not include any definition of salmon. As you know, salmon includes a variety of species. It could be salmon, there's other salmonids like steelhead, and there's no limitation there. So we could be talking about salmon that are focused in the Pacific Northwest, or we could be talking about steelhead that may or may not be present in creeks in Southern California. There's a big difference as to the range of what would be touched here. The other issue is the one that brought up in my written testimony was there's no limitation truly on whether or not the salmon are present in the habitat that is designated as a salmon conservation area, and whether or not that habitat needs to be improved in order for them to be there. And this is an issue that has been litigated extensively under the Endangered Species Act, and most recently the Supreme Court determined that it's inappropriate for the federal government to be designated critical habitat if species are not present, and the habitat needs to be improved for them to be there. So the scope of the conservation areas are concerning because they're very broad, and because there's a potential for interaction with other federal laws like the Clean Water Act. And I'm getting short on time, so I want to turn to the Nepa amendment, the proposed Nepa amendment. That amendment would require any projects that trigger Nepa, those that require federal action, to adopt the option under the Nepa analysis that it has the least impact on salmon. And that's choosing winners in a way that Nepa has never done before. And so we're very concerned about the modification to Nepa, but also the concept, because it would prioritize salmon over water supply infrastructure, which may be the goal of some, obviously a concern to the water industry. But it would also do that as to species. So certain endangered species may not enjoy habitat that's ideal for salmon, and that kind of language would inhibit the ability to do restoration projects for those species. So I'm just about out of time. I just really want to reiterate that we appreciate the opportunity to testify. I appreciate the opportunity to provide input on this, and look forward to working with the committee and to work together to find a way forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'll start off with the questions, and since we have a pretty small number of members, it's my intention to allow 2 rounds with this panel. So if we don't get to you in the first 5 minutes, if I don't, I want to ask all of you some questions. Don't panic. We're going to come back around. But Mr. Monit, picking up where you left off, if we could just go a little deeper into that. You're not wrong on the NEPA part. I think I need to clean that up. It is not my intention to reinvent the NEPA process and to pick winners in what should be an honest analysis. So point well taken in that regard. But, and I'm happy to clarify that my intention is to apply to all salmon. It's not just salmon to the exclusion of steelhead. Now, you're not going to have a lot of abundance of Southern California steelhead such that you might see a lot of conservation areas in controversial places in Malibu and other spots, but I'd like to leave open the possibility that there could be regionally significant strongholds or conservation areas, even for those hard-to-find Southern California salmonids. So that would be my intention, and I would love to work with you to make sure that we get that right. In the bigger picture of this bill, it's one that I think many of your clients should actually like, and I will tell you why. You know that in a prior life, your firm and I squared off over some of these fights. So you've got a great law firm. I respect a lot of your colleagues. But restoring the San Joaquin River, for example, in that process, trying to bring back to life a deeply degraded, actually dewatered river that had totally extirpated its once prolific salmon runs was a heavy lift. And in the course of that, we often heard, why don't you just focus on these other areas where we still have large salmon populations, and let's maximize what we've got there. That's what this bill tries to do. So I would think, from the perspective of water users who in many cases on these, in these watersheds where we're struggling just to hang on to salmon in areas that have been badly degraded, the idea of going big in areas where there often aren't water projects, so you don't have the same kind of conflicts, and maximizing abundance in those areas, that ought to be something we can all work on. Wouldn't you agree?
You know, I'd love to see how this legislation moves forward because there are a lot of things to like in there. Again, providing federal dollars for habitat restoration is really not usually a controversial thing, and it provides a lot of things for people to enjoy. So again, we'd love to see how it develops.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I have, made careful note of several of your technical points, which again are well taken. So I'd like to go to Vice Chairman Myers. And Vice Chairman, as we were talking about fishery disaster relief, you mentioned the compounding impacts each year, especially when you have multiple years of fishery disaster while you're waiting to get that relief. Can you elaborate on the timeframes set forth in my bill and why that is so important to tribes and communities like yours who are struggling with multi-year fishery disasters?
You're absolutely correct, Chairman. The issue moving forward is compounded when you move from one year to the next. I think what is exciting for us to look at in this bill are the timelines set forward. In theory, if there was funding available, we could see funding within a year. And I think that's critical for us, where it takes 3 to 4 years most of the time for the funding to come down. I also think it's critical for us as a government to have an understanding of where we're at in the process when we submit for disaster relief funding. I think it's critical so that we can plan for our services, for our members, moving forward where we're at in the process. So I think the timeline set out in the bill work well for us.
Okay, and what about the issue of direct funding to fishers as an eligible use of disaster relief? Obviously, we all would like to see retraining, and we want to see your Yurok tribe members, learn how to do computer coding and other interesting things. But you're a fishing people, and you'd like to keep fishing, I assume. So can you talk about the importance of codifying the eligibility of direct funding to fishers for this disaster relief?
One of the reasons I told our traditional story to begin the meeting is we've come through times of short before. In our oral traditions, in our oral story, we know that there's been lean times of salmon on the Klamath River before. We know we can come back from it. That's why it's important for us to continue that way of life. We know the salmon can come back. We know they can recover. For us, it is a way of life in that it is also a part of our culture and our spirituality. And when you remove that, you remove a piece of our identity, similar to the way the boarding schools did within our nations.
All right. Thank you, sir. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Monit, you did mention in your testimony that in the language, although it's just a seemingly small provision, there could be change in the standard and how Nepa is implemented. And the sponsor and the chairman had mentioned, and I greatly appreciate the potential that he would take a look at that language. But when looking at that language, what should the focus be? Where should that focus go in terms of a potential relook at that language regarding Nepa?
From my perspective, I think it would be best to remove the NEPA amendment entirely and let NEPA stand on its own. NEPA operates to require federal agencies to analyze their impact, the environmental impacts of their projects, and then recommend mitigation measures if they're going to be significant impacts. Other federal schemes then implement those mitigation measures. For example, if one was going to get a 404 permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, that would trigger a NEPA review, and then analysis would include a description of impacts and some potential mitigation measures. And then the Army Corps would then implement or require implementation of those mitigation measures as a condition of the permit, not NEPA itself. This provision is somewhat, it's written in a way that almost makes NEPA a substantive requirement rather than allowing it to operate the way it always has, which would be to allow other federal schemes to then implement the mitigation measures.
Thank you for that. In regard to the language, on a similar note, you'd mentioned the language regarding salmon conservation area. Once again, the sponsor and chairman very kindly said that they potentially take a look at that language. But in regard to that definition of salmon conservation area, the potential of that being pretty broad. The way it is right now, what would be the potential problems with the language as it is now?
The big concern is, I think it's paragraph 3C that states that a watershed can be designated as a salmon conservation area if it is regionally significant for salmon. And that would be, of course, in the opinion of the Fish and Wildlife Service. But there's very few limitations on that. So the concern that came to our mind is the one that's in the written testimony was that there's no limitation, no requirement that the salmon have to be there or the habitat doesn't have to be improved in some way for them to be there. Those are the major concerns on that. So we would look for changes that limited the scope of what could be named as a conservation area. I think along with that comes the input provisions, because the conservation areas are set up right now to get some public input. Fish and Wildlife's directed to get some input. It's directed to get input from the states and tribal interests, and then may consider input from NGOs, the public, but who are absent from that list are water users and public agencies that distribute water.
So that actually leads me to my next question. I just got less than a couple minutes left. So on that front, Bureau of Reclamation is the federal agency in charge of managing and developing the water resources in the West, as you know. So should we be concerned that they're not listed as one of those relevant federal agencies here?
It was a concern for me, but I believe that it's something that is easily corrected by adding to the list. But we want to make sure is that water interests are heard, especially those like the Bureau of Reclamation, but those of us, the clients that I tend to represent in California that are individual retail water supply agencies and wholesale water supply agencies. Their interests are critical because, again, without water, our economy's nowhere, we have nothing.
And you feel the same way with the involvement of local municipalities and the water users in the regions?
I do.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, with that, those are all the questions that I had. I do have some letters. Oh, excuse me. I do have one more question here from my brains to the right here. My right brain, yeah. Ms. Ralston, does the American Sport Fishing Association support 1834, Mr. Rooney's bill?
Thank you for the question. Two things. First, I will say, coming from Florida, the impacts to our coral reefs have been devastating. We have seen the tissue loss disease has just gone from one end to the other and really wreaked havoc. From an association's perspective, there are many stressors to coral reefs. We would have concerns over a wholesale ban outright because anglers are on the water. And I know there was some conversations earlier about the melanoma aspect, and we would hate to do anything that would dissuade folks from using sunscreen.
Okay, so not a blind support then, but we're out of time, so, all right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I do have some letters. I'd just like to ask unanimous consent if we could enter into the record. I've got two regarding 4723, one from the National Water Resource Association, one from the Association of California Water Agencies. I've got three regarding HR 2236, one from the Mid-Atlantic, North Pacific Fishery Management Councils. I'd like to ask unanimous consent we can enter those in the record, please.
Without objection. All right, I thank the ranking member, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Costa for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I think a number of us have noted, I think this is important legislation, and I do believe, Mr. Chairman, that your sense is to try to get some piece of legislation that could pass not only the House but the Senate and become law, so that in fact the intentions, the goals could be realized. For that, this thoughtful conversation I think is going to have to continue as we deal with definitions, as we deal with potential impacts, whether they be intended or unintended. I want to try to drill down a little bit, Mr. Monit, on the point you raised on definitions as it relates to Nepa and its potential impact, whether we're talking about Section 5B or other elements. Could you provide a little more detail as to what you think needs to be addressed?
Well, thank you for the question, and I just reiterate, I think that the proposed Nepa amendment would be best removed from the legislation, in my opinion, because there's already a complex legal landscape here, and Nepa already would apply to any federal actions in a salmon conservation area. And there
Because
are-
the grant programs, I think, is really one of the stronger parts of this legislation. And having been engaged in the legislation on the restoration of the salmon run on the San Joaquin River that the chairman was also engaged in a different life, I was just there last week, and I can point to you the returns that we've seen, and we are having success. And the question is how we provide that balance, I think, as you stated earlier, between all the beneficial uses of the water as it relates to not only fisheries, but also as it relates to water use for municipal purposes as well as for agricultural purposes. And Mr. Monit, do you have some ideas or thoughts about how that balance is struck?
I think it's always a difficult balance. I think having an impact on the environment is part of the human condition. So we're always going to have some impact, and the question is how to balance it. So it's not easy.
Well, and I think it's even more critical in terms of, in light of climate change. While many of us are trying to mitigate the impacts of that climate change, the fact is that we're seeing sea levels rise. We're seeing changes as it relates to the events on our rainfall and our snowpack in California, specifically on the West Coast. Mr. Myers, you talked, and I thought it was very heart-rendering as to the history, the rich tradition of your tribe on the Northwest. And I'm just wondering how you gave some numbers that were very large in terms of salmon fisheries on the Klamath. 200 years ago, when your tribe was thriving and it was a different world, we had 1.7 billion people on the planet. A couple years ago, we clicked 7 billion people. By the middle of this century, we'll have 9 billion people, and climate change. I'm wondering, how do we balance to maintain the traditions of your tribe, as well as the importance of maintaining fisheries and salmon, in light of the fact that the world's changed dramatically in 200 years? What in your estimation, Mr. Myers, is realistic in terms of maintaining your traditions and your ability to fish, realizing that it's a different world?
Thank you for that question. I appreciate it. One that we have a discussion on quite a bit. I will say that there is a priority and a need for our tribal traditions to continue, but I think as we move towards the future and we look at the growing need for a reliable food source for our population as a whole, the ability for salmon to play a much larger role in the diet of this nation, I think is going to be critical. Not only does it supply a phenomenal protein, but it also gives benefit back to the
No, I don't think anyone's doubting you. I'm a big, avid supporter of that. I just had some last night. But that aside, National Geographic, and I'm going to try to get a copy and hand it to everybody here, a number of years ago did a very thoughtful piece, as they do, on the history of salmon in the Northwest all the way up to Alaska and into the Aleutians, and talked about how dramatic the changes have taken place over the last 100 years for a lot of reasons, notwithstanding climate change. And I think if we're going to be successful in this legislation, I think we really have to figure out not only how we do a robust restoration and grant program, but how we deal with it on the competing uses of that very important resource, water, which we were all dependent upon. So that balance is going to be critical, I think, for the success of this legislation.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question, Ms. Ralston, you perhaps heard some of the dialogue on the Descend Act. Do you believe that there are, do you have concerns with our ability, working with Noaa, to implement that legislation?
Thank you for the question. No, sir, I do not. I regularly attend South Atlantic Fishery Management Council meetings, and that council actually has mandatory mandatory regulation on the books that's just going into effect. And there's also examples on the West Coast as well. Don't see any issues implementing it in the Gulf.
And so I did mention that to the Admiral. So again, South Atlantic effectively has a mandatory use or locked and loaded.
Rigged and ready.
Yep, yeah, rigged and ready, locked and loaded. Yeah, probably.
Yes, sir. In fact, my understanding in the Gulf Council is that the issue had more to do with the concern over losing the ability to apply oil spill funding.
Yep.
And that was why the council backed off of that.
Yeah, yeah.
So they never had a robust discussion because of that.
Yep. So which clearly, if this does help with species sustainability, that's part of the intent of the oil spill funds. So do you believe that that this is a burden on anglers? Would you perceive it as a burden, or would you look at this like something that while it does take some degree of work or even getting a complementary device, certainly worth the outcome that we may be able to increase fisheries by 8.5% in regard to red snapper?
Well, I think first, it's good conservation, and so it's difficult to argue against that. Secondly, some of the studies that we've been engaged in distributing descending devices to anglers have indicated that they are very much willing to use them. They just need to be educated.
Which you bring up a good point. I think that was covered in y'all's letter, if I remember right. But there actually have been pilots where these have been handed out to anglers and came back with very good feedback. And like I said, I've fished with them and fished with, spoken to a number of other anglers who have fished with them as well and do get good feedback. One other question for you, HR 5548, the fisheries disaster. Do you have any thoughts on that legislation?
Yes, sir. First, I would say that we very much appreciate the inclusion of the sport fishing industry in statute, as would be proposed under this bill.
Because of the huge economic impact that your industry is often underappreciated for, I think.
Absolutely. In Florida alone, where we've had Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Michael in the last couple of years, it's an $11.5 billion industry just in that state alone. So it has huge repercussions, and the ability for the sport fishing industry to be included in distribution of those dollars is very important.
Mr. Chairman, I want to make note on this legislation. So this is about disasters, which often includes things like hurricanes, or in the case of this year, the high water in the river and the need to operate the spillways. This really is a problem that affects, in my opinion, every aspect of disasters. We did in late 2018, in fact, with your help, enacted the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which I think was really good legislation helping to change a number of FEMA laws, great bipartisan bill that was signed into law in October of 2018. But this whole issue of funding here and needs over here and the ability to connect the dots, it's not just about fishers. We're dealing with a disaster at home. It was an August 2016 flood, and we still have, I think we secured $1.7 billion in disaster funding for individuals, for individual disaster victims. And last time I looked, I think they had actually given, or not even given, offered to flood victims $671 million of, I'll say it again, $1.7 billion, and here we are nearly, three and a half years after the disaster. This doesn't just apply to fisheries. It is, we re-victimize, as a government, we re-victimize disaster victims. And so I would like to work with you on this, but unfortunately, it transcends disasters. It's everything.
Amen. Well, if the gentleman will indulge me for a few of the final seconds.
Absolutely, they're yours.
If you come out to California, we will show you how FEMA is now trying to reach into the PG&E bankruptcy proceeding and claw back money from victims that were told that wouldn't happen. So yeah, we re-victimize all the time in this process, and it needs improvement. We're going to be working as we continue with this Magnuson effort on the possibility of something like crop insurance in the area of commercial fishing. that would take the government a little more out of the picture and have a better predictability and better efficiency. But love to have your collaboration on that.
Look forward to working with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Yeah. So thank you. I will take us into the next round for those who want to participate. I know Mr. Cunningham is desperately trying to get here, so we hope he can join us. Vice Chairman Myers, just continuing on the fishery disaster issue with you, can you explain why comparing your losses to the most recent 5-year time period to get your disaster relief quantified just doesn't work when you're dealing with multi-year fishery disasters like the ones that you've seen? There he is. Okay. Please continue, Vice Chair.
Thank you for that question. What could possibly happen and what may happen next year if we don't see a turnaround, for us, using the 5-year period could be detrimental if we move through a cycle of disaster relief past that 4-year mark, where for the past 3 years we've declared, this last year we declared, if we don't see a turnaround next year, it could be using this model that our loss could be qualified as 0.
Thank you for that clarification. Mr. Clifford, I want to talk a little more about salmonids here. You're an expert on salmon salmonid conservation. What do you see as the primary driver of population declines, and what do you think is needed to slow that decline of salmonid populations?
Mr. Chairman, in our experience, the primary driver that we see of the current declines is simply bad management decisions of the past. And I want to be clear about this. We're not talking about bad development per se, because as I said in my testimony, we actually find that things like timber management, if done according to modern standards, are actually quite compatible with fish habitat values. But for example, in the past, when logging was done in the 50s or 40s, they did not keep it away from streams, so it damaged the riparian zone. They did not, when they were, to add insult to injury, when they were done logging, they would pull all the wood they could out of the stream, because they're salmon, right? Got to help them migrate upstream. And that turned out to ruin the habitat for like young rearing fish. And so a lot of what we do now is projects to replace, large wood in streams, put woody, the habitat back in the stream, and things like repairing damaged culverts so that fish can swim upstream and reach good habitat, things like that.
Mm-hmm. In your written testimony, you talk about how Trout Unlimited is pleased with the bill providing for regional salmon conservation areas. There's been some discussion about that provision here. Can you describe why identifying regionally significant areas is important for the conservation of salmon? And again, I will clarify that it is not my intention to have conservation areas that don't have any fish in them, but we'll clean that up in the bill as it goes forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the best way to answer that question is to provide an example. And as you know, in Southern California, the range of steelhead extends all the way down to the Mexican border. So Southern California is an important area for fish. Now, there are key watersheds that are important to steelhead in that area, but they're never going to produce the number of fish that, say, the Smith River in Northern California will, which is a very productive watershed. But in the context of that southern habitat zone, they're very important to the recovery of those species. And so in the context of that area, that's a regionally important stronghold, and this bill would allow that to be designated. I want to say quickly, I don't share this concern, I think like you, it's been expressed about the idea of designating strongholds with no fish in them, and the reason for that is we've already seen what this looks like on the ground in California. Strongholds are a familiar concept from conservation biology. You come up with a bunch of scientific criteria. One of those criteria is current population status and trends.
Right.
And that's never going to take you to those watersheds that are currently unpopulated, and that's what we've seen in California.
And I will demystify that in improvements to the bill, but yeah, we did include abundance as one of the factors. You're obviously not going to score on that factor if you don't have any fish, but we'll clean that up. Thank you. In the time I have left, so Mr. Monit, back to the technical aspect of making this bill go forward for salmonid conservation. What I'm really trying to do here, and I'm interested in your expertise on it, is we don't have any process in these areas where we haven't yet wrecked the habitat for salmon and steelhead to force a higher level of consultation as land managers and others propose to do new things in those watersheds. I think it's important that we're able to identify at least some places where we're just going to have that higher consideration. But I don't want to rewrite Nepa. I understand how fraught that would be. So do you have any thoughts on how we might be able to at least force a more serious conversation about conserving habitat in these areas without the tripwires of Nepa?
Well, thank you for the question and the opportunity to provide input. I think, the federal government's in a position where it has a variety of tools it can use for problems like this. There's carrots and there's sticks, and this bill...
More than just a grant program, though, because I love the grants too, but...
I think ostensibly, again, we'd like to see how the bill develops. Ostensibly,
Yeah.
designated salmon conservation areas on their own might not be something that's an awful thing to do, but we just need to see how things develop and how they're implemented. And I'm happy to work with you and your staff to come up with ideas to...
Good. We'll take you up on that. I think we're... Mr. Graves, did you want to keep going?
I think we're going to go first.
Okay. Mr. Cunningham, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I appreciate that, and thank you, my colleague from Louisiana. I apologize for my tardiness. I can only see my colleague from Louisiana just failed to save me a seat on Air Force One coming back, so I resorted to Air Force 6 this morning out of New Orleans. So
I think they just let the winning team go.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Touche. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this hearing today, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this legislative hearing and for including my bill, H.R. 4679. Does he have to have unanimous consent to put that there?
Are we complying with the rules, Mr. Chairman? I'm sure the
Is there
member
screens
meant
anymore?
no.
Oh, wow. Oh, look at that. Wow, I didn't realize that. I'm sorry.
If this were a football game, he'd be penalized for taunting at this point.
It is. I mean, ruthless.
All right, I'm sorry. I removed it from the shelf.
On to bigger things. Thanks again for holding this hearing, and thanks for including our bill, H.R. 4679, the Climate Ready Fisheries Act, which addresses one of the most important challenges facing our nation's fisheries, climate change. Climate change is rapidly altering the abundance, productivity, and distribution of our nation's fish stocks. In fact, the latest report to Congress from Noaa Fisheries cited environmental changes as one of the key factors driving the decline of 8 stocks added to the overfished list in 2018. The latest trends make it clear that climate change is already happening, and the need to make our fisheries climate ready is urgent. Recent scientific reports, like the IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate, emphasize that maintaining sustainable fisheries management, from ending overfishing to rebuilding fish stocks to healthy levels, is one of the most critical actions we can take for climate readiness in our oceans. Well-managed fisheries are resilient fisheries that reduce the negative impacts of climate change on coastal communities and their economies. The impacts of climate change, however, including warming waters, ocean acidification, and deoxygenation, are already putting pressure on our fishery science and management system. Our fishing communities are facing increasing challenges due to fish stocks shifting away from the traditional fishing grounds, declines in fishery productivity due to changing conditions and flooding from sea level rise that inundates homes and businesses. In our districts in South Carolina, Noaa Fisheries, the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission are already laying the groundwork to manage our fisheries for a changing ocean. But Congress needs to make sure that these fisheries managers have what they need to be successful. By understanding what innovative approaches have already been tried and then identifying where there are gaps and where there are needs, Congress can support these efforts by fishery managers, scientists, stakeholders, and fishermen. That's why my bill, the Climate Ready Fisheries Act, directs the GAO to examine what actions have already been taken by fishery managers, identify whether any knowledge and funding gaps are hindering action, and then provide recommendations for how we can better adapt fishery management and prepare fishing industries and communities for the impacts of environmental changes. As an independent, nonpartisan agency made of expert analysts who provide objective, reliable information to Congress, the GAO is uniquely qualified to conduct this review. This past October, I was back in the district holding a roundtable with fishermen back there and talking about the effects of climate change. People went out shrimping, where in the past they get hundreds of pounds of shrimp. Now they're coming back with 50 pounds of shrimp. all to changing conditions, including the changing temperature of the oceans. Over and over again, these people brought up how clearly they can see changes on the water that are directly related to climate change. Fish traditionally caught in our region are starting to migrate to other regions. These types of climate-related impacts are having direct consequences for our fishermen and their ability to make a living and spend time on the water with their families. Climate change is nothing to joke about, and our low-country fishermen know that better than anyone. It's time for Congress to ensure that our fisheries are resilient. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his leadership on this issue, and I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their... Oh, Mr. Costa, you want to go another? Yes. Well, you said second. I did. You're right. I'm sorry. I'd lost track of. I lost track of how many times around the. Yeah. Please, by all means, you're recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Monit, we talked about the multiple beneficial uses of water, obviously, throughout the world in light of climate change. What do you think are the likely ramifications of a water reliability in terms of supply for the 32 million Californians that are dependent upon water from delta tributaries, as an example, if this legislation were to become law as it is?
So if written as is, this law, the proposed the Fish Act, my concern is that, especially as to the Nepa amendment, it would prevent any kind of maintenance to existing facilities in the Delta right now.
You're talking about for the competing beneficial uses of that water?
Correct, but I'm talking about the Nepa amendment as written. The concern I would have is that it could be interpreted so stringently that it would prevent maintenance to even existing infrastructure that's in the Delta right now, let alone allowing for construction of improvements to that infrastructure or new infrastructure to allow water to be conveyed. So, I mean, again, we were very glad to hear that, I was very glad to hear that amendment's up for changes, and that wasn't the intention at all. But obviously, I'm thinking in worst-case scenarios. You know,
so how does that translate in a real example? Right now, we have the issue that's involved with state regulatory authority under the State Water Board on unimpaired flows on three tributaries, the Merced, the Tuolumne, and the Stanislaus, that you may be familiar with. And the question being is, what is the best way to restore fisheries on those three tributaries versus not only these unimpaired flows and what amount they should be or what level, also versus other means to improve habitat that could potentially provide greater restoration of fisheries?
So thank you for the question again, and this goes to the question before from the chairman. The government has a variety of tools. There's carrots and there's sticks, and it's not just grants that we can use. There's habitat conservation plans. There's other voluntary actions that can bring agencies, people, water users to the table. They just need incentives to get there. It might be money. It might be regulatory relief somewhere else. And I think the habitat conservation plans provide a good model, and they've been used in other watersheds to allow everybody to at least come close to getting what they need.
Well, in this real case example that I cited, we have the challenge of overlapping responsibilities and regulatory regimes between the state and the federal authorities, and trying to work that out is a challenge, to say the least. And I am one who believes that in most cases it's better to work these things out than to go to court and have lengthy litigation, which I think this potentially could create. What's your thought?
Well, I would agree that fixing problems before they happen is the best approach, and having a conversation like the one we're having today is very helpful and can help avoid future litigation.
Mr. Clifford, I read your testimony, and you talk about in the page 3, I believe, that you're looking to improve efficiency of irrigation systems to allow them to leave more water in stream and get credit for the state regulators, and that these projects strengthen long-term viability and stronghold habitat and provide our partners protection against regulatory burdens. I think that statement on the face of it is probably correct. The challenge that we face, and I don't know how familiar you are with a very historic landmark piece of legislation that Governor Brown signed called SIGMA, which is a sustainable groundwater management plans that are being formed with these GSA models that have been developed on groundwater basins throughout the San Joaquin Valley and Sacramento, but mainly. We've become very efficient in many of our water districts in irrigation, to your point. As a matter of fact, that we're just irrigating root zones, and that part can be good. But there is a trade-off, as we know, and that is if you do nothing to recharge the groundwater, then we continue to have subsidence, we continue to have overdraft, and we don't have a sustainable supply. How do, in your comments here, do you figure to balance? I mean, we need to recharge, and we need to get our groundwater in balance to avoid subsidence, but yet we want to be as efficient as we possibly can.
Thank you for the question. Well, that testimony particularly you cited cites our work in Deer Creek in the northern Central Valley, and actually this is an issue that we're dealing with very much.
And Deer Creek's important, Battle Creek's important. There's a
Yes.
lot of good things that are going on here.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And so the first thing we're doing with our flow work there is a groundwater study to actually try and assess and model the capacity of that local aquifer, because we understand that using groundwater seasonally in that system is actually part of the solution. There are times when, with proper recharge, we can use that groundwater as an alternative and not divert from the creek during the most harmful times, provided that we take care and manage it sustainably. And so that's something that we're investing in as a solution long-term to maintaining stream flows and preserving access to that stronghold habitat.
Well, Mr. Chairman, this is part of a longer conversation, and my time has run out, but that balance is very challenging. I'm in the middle of working with trying to implement this law successfully.
You're welcome.
And the competing other uses, and to achieve sustainability not only for our fisheries, but sustainability for our farmers and our farm communities. And the question of how you define sustainability with that limited resource in light of climate change is the challenge we face. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman, and we really are at the end now. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We will ask them to respond to those questions in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following this hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days to allow for responses. If there's no further business before the committee, seeing none, without objection, we stand adjourned. Thank you.